Annie, what reporting have you on the current state of the Trump-Giuliani friendship, relationship, for starters?
Well, there's two prongs to it. Trump himself seems to be standing by Giuliani for now, while the rest of the White House basically has wanted him thrown under the bus as long as he's been on the bus. I mean, he's been causing problems. They really view him more as a friend who's freelancing. That's the way they viewed him the whole time, than a real defense lawyer who's part of a overarching strategy here. Remember, since he admitted that Trump repaid Michael Cohen for the Stormy Daniels hush money payment, he has been causing problems for this White House. But Trump, for a variety of reasons, seems to, every time he's asked about him, seems to call him the greatest mayor that New York City ever had, and a great lawyer, and it might just be that he's too close to lose at this point for Trump. But there's no signs that he's doing the usual I barely know him shtick with Giuliani.
Katie Benner, people were surprised at the kind of supplicant the Attorney General turned into once he was on the job. But then the subject of spying came up a few months back at the hearing on the Hill. People were stunned by the answer. I want to play the exchange. We'll talk about it on the other side.
I think spying on a political campaign is a big deal. You're not suggesting, though, that spying occurred. I don't, I guess you could, I think spying did occur. Yes, I think spying did occur.
So, Katie, fast forward to 2 weeks ago, we see, waiting for the president to depart from the White House, a kind of animated discussion going on in the Oval Office, including that man, the guy you cover on a daily basis, the Attorney General. What's the chance, just thinking out loud here, that the AG went to give his brother a heads up on the early look at the IG report to let him know, hey, boss, it's not going to find that there was spying?
Well, I'm not going to go inside of Bill Barr's head, but I will say that he is the Attorney General, and he does brief the president on a variety of topics. What's interesting about the spying language that Barr used in the hearing that you played is that it's been adopted by the president, and we're showing that the report that's going to come out on December 9th, we have reporting that shows it erodes the argument that there was the kind of spying that Trump has been alluding to now for weeks, if not months, which is that there was a mole inside his campaign, that there was somebody inside who was taking notes and then delivering that information to the intelligence agencies. That is going to be knocked down in this report. Now, whether there was surveillance, there was a wiretap of a former Trump campaign advisor, yes, but the idea that there was somebody inside of the campaign, which Trump has been alluding to for a while, that is not the case.
Hey, John, if the Sondland phone call with Trump story becomes unwound in a more concrete way, will that cost Republican support?
I'm not sure that it will cost Republican support in terms of members of Congress, Brian, but, you know, the veil that the president has over the idea that there was not a quid pro quo, that there wasn't bribery, extortion, that there was not a relationship between the probes that he was seeking and the money he was holding up has all but disintegrated already. That's the one sort of thin reed that exists for him. And so Sondland's call going away would be perhaps important to some of the voters out there, particularly if Democrats in Congress can explain that to people in an effective way. And, you know, the other thing I would look at with that is even with Sondland talking about that call, even if that call occurred, even if the president said that, what we already know is that for months, from the testimony we've seen, for months there was no explanation of the freeze on the money. And then once the White House was aware of the whistleblower complaint, once they were aware that the appropriators in Congress were asking questions about that money, then the president is supposed to have had this discussion with Sondland where he says, no, I don't want a quid pro quo. You know, the time element is clear in all of this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.